Hi everybody, good evening. Welcome to the webinar. It is Tuesday, December 27th, 2016. I hope you're having a great and safe holiday season. Tonight, I've been asked by one of our therapists to talk about parenting styles, specifically authoritarian, authoritative, and permissive styles. I'll also add on to that one where we talk about it being either chaotic or uninvolved. And this is a careful webinar, or a careful topic, that is, to present, because I think it's one of those topics that can lead people to feel guilty, lead people to focus on what they haven't done well, the mistakes that they've made. Also, it can I think, sometimes communicate a cause and effect kind of dynamic between parents and children, or at least cause us to think that way. So I'm going to also talk about some of the issues surrounding the guilt, the shame, the blame, and also how we can understand this pattern, these patterns, and understand the effects without simplifying it down to a simple cause and effect relationship. I found this quote that I thought was a good way to start off tonight. A study released by the California Parenting Institute Tuesday shows that every style of parenting inevitably causes children to grow up into profoundly unhappy adults. Quote, our research suggests that while overprotective parenting ultimately produces adults unprepared to contend with life's difficulties, highly permissive parenting leads to feelings of bitterness and isolation throughout adulthood, lead researcher Daniel Porter said. And interestingly, we found that anything between those two extremes is equally damaging, always resulting in an adult who suffers from some debilitating combination of unpreparedness and isolation. Despite great variance in parenting styles across population, the end product is always the same, a profoundly flawed and joyless human being. The study did find, however, that adults often achieve temporary happiness when they have children of their own to perpetuate the cycle of human misery. Obviously, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, and I think it's trying to poke fun at some of the ideas around talking about parenting styles, right? That we can get it perfect, that there's this illusion that you can somehow find and develop this perfect way of parenting, and then our children are going to be miraculously, or at least happy the rest of their life. So I thought a little humor would be an okay way to start with this tonight. Sometimes the parenting style is similar to the way we bring from our own parenting, our own childhood, and the parenting that we receive. We often bring some of those styles forward. And a lot of parents will talk about it by trying to compensate, right? Trying to compensate for either their history with their parents, or sometimes compensating for their partner's history, for their partner's, the way their partner parents. Either way, the core dynamic in that is that the child is missed, right? When we're not focusing on hearing and seeing the child, and we're focusing on either repairing our own childhood, or we're just unconsciously perpetuating our own childhood onto our children, then we're not seeing the child. And so I'll talk about that as we go along tonight too. Like Alice Miller talks about, and I quote it all the time on the first page of her book, she says, examining your childhood is one of the most effective ways, a necessary way to prevent the problems or the passing on of our trauma and in our parenting to our children. It's the most important thing that we can do to understand our parenting style. So the first thing that we have to do to be able to see the child is to see ourselves first, right? The more we can, as I say, draw that line around who we are, more clearly we can figure out who we are, the more able we're going to be able to see our child. If that line is fuzzy or not filled in or has gaps in it, then we will be unclear about who we are seeing, part of ourselves or really somebody else. This is not a simple cause and effect idea tonight, but it does help us to understand cycles and dynamics. And in family systems theory, they talk about cycles, right? Your children come with a certain temperament. They make certain choices. That affects you. Like I've talked about recently, I think many of us who are in this have experienced trauma from some of our children's behaviors. So then that's going to have an impact or an effect on us. The way that they are temperamentally is going to have an impact on us, which in turn then we will respond, and then we create this cycle. Punctuation is a fairly arbitrary way of kind of taking that round circle apart and drawing it into a straight line. We talk about a beginning and an end, but it's somewhat arbitrary. It's like the chicken and the egg question. But it does help us to talk about dynamics, about the way we impact each other at times. So tonight, maybe more than many of the webinars I've done lately, is I want to talk about awareness without the shame. In fact, the lack of shame is going to create better awareness. And to create more awareness, we're going to have to do battle with our own shame. But if looking at ourselves, our patterns, our flawedness, looking at that stuff causes us to feel shame, then it's going to be more difficult to look at. But it is possible. It is possible in doing this work to say, I can see my part in it. I can see the ways that I dented my child, so to speak. And at the same time, I'm not overwhelmed by shame or guilt or regret. I want to just acknowledge that I looked on several different places for this, but a lot of the content was from a website called verywell.com, who I thought said things very simply and clearly. All right, let's talk about authoritarian parenting. Autocratic, sometimes this is called autocratic, refers to rigid parenting style, also known as authoritarian style. Autocratic parents want their children to be well-behaved and successful, but their strict manner of parenting doesn't allow for much flexibility. Authoritarian parents expect children to live up to their demands without explanation. This type of parenting does have its benefits, but the child of an autocratic parent may suffer adverse effects such as an underdeveloped sense of self. And that's really important, because there are, in these cases, in this kind of system, there are benefits. They can be successful in many spheres of life. But what is often lacking is a sense of self, who they are, because the self wasn't valued, right? What was valued were the accomplishments, were the cooperation, the obedience, the successes, if you will. And what was undervalued was the child's feelings and who the child was. I see in a lot of the parents that I work with this kind of childhood. And many of the parents that I work with then try to compensate by giving it all to the child, right? By bringing the child up in such a way that the child becomes almost a peer to the parent. So that's one way that, again, that compensatory parenting can affect our children. Let's talk about what authoritarian parenting looks like. Authoritarian parenting is where parents establish the rules and expect that children will follow them without exception. So very little of a child's being is seen or appreciated or valued except for cooperation. The children in these cases have little to no involvement in problem-solving challenges or obstacles. They're usually not given the reasons for the rules, and there is little room for any negotiation. Authoritarian parents may favor punishment as a reinforcer response instead of positive reinforcement. Now, here's that thing again that just rings in my ear because I'm thinking about so many of the parents that I've worked with over the years. I think a lot of parents experience this kind of parenting from their own parents. And so because they weren't considered, because they weren't asked how they felt, it wasn't valued, where they weren't giving any voice in the negotiation, I think the parents will often compensate by giving it all to the children, giving the children equal vote, making it a democracy. Although children who grew up with authoritarian parents tend to follow rules much of the time, they may lack development of a self. Again, it goes back to that self. One is to do the right thing no matter how one feels. In fact, how one feels doesn't really matter because this is not a matrix where feelings are even considered. It's about doing the quote-unquote right thing. Children may develop hostile or aggressive responses. They oftentimes prefer punishment rather than learning how to make decisions. Excuse me. They might experience hostility and aggressiveness to punishment rather than learning how to make decisions and solve problems. And so again, in the child, they're not struggling through it, right? That's not even value. I talk about this all the time about how one of the things I see with the parents that I work with is the lack of value to the mistakes and the struggle. Right? That's not something that is seen as a valuable part of the process in authoritarian or autocratic families. In the strict father family, this is a phrase used by Lakoff, In the strict father family, father knows best. He knows right from wrong and has the ultimate authority to make sure his children and his spouse do what he says, which is taken to be what is right. Many conservative spouses accept this worldview, uphold the father's authority, and are strict in those realms of family life that they are in charge of. When his children disobey, it is his moral duty to punish them painfully enough so that, to avoid punishment, they will obey him, do what is right, and not just do what feels good. Through physical discipline, they are supposed to become disciplined, internally strong, and able to prosper in the external world. What if they don't prosper? That means they are not disciplined and therefore cannot be moral, and so deserve their poverty. So again, you see one aspect in this is that the strict father family, as Lakoff calls it, there tends to be more physical discipline, or that's more common. Aggression is a parenting style, often an authoritarian parenting, intimidating. Really, it's almost compliance by any means necessary. And then J.D. Gill goes on to say, in such a family context, what is able to be experienced is determined by the adult and followed by the child. This is considered ordinary. This is a big deal, a big point that she makes in her work, right? Everybody considers their family somewhat ordinary until they have an experience outside of it, a substantial experience outside of it. Not doing this, not having this kind of family system is considered unordinary or abnormal. And that's from Gill's new book called Seeing. Signs that you might be an authoritarian parent, it's the my way or the highway. There's little negotiation. There's very little patience for misbehavior. What is valued is obedience, cooperation, compliance. There's a focus on controlling the child's behavior. This is a very symptom-focused system, right? The opposite of the authoritarian would be, for example, to take a step back and say, why is my child doing this? Why are they struggling? What's going on inside of them? The use of shame is very common to get compliance. Again, because it's any means necessary, shame is not considered to be negative because it gets complete. Shaming can be one of the most powerfully effective behavioral tools. It happens to come at a great cost of the person's psyche, but it does work to get compliance very powerfully. The use of corporal punishment is more common in autocratic or authoritarian families. They don't believe in an exception to the rule. It's a very rigid way of thinking, very black and white. They prefer punishment over positive reinforcement. They value discipline over fun. They have a lot of rules. Low trust for children. And I thought about this a lot because part of this, I think with our children, they're at a point where trusting them would be a mistake in some ways. So these are people that have very little trust for younger children, right? And part of trusting our child is to know also that there's going to be some mistakes, there's going to be some errors, and that's going to be a part of the learning process. Because I said so is the mentality, it's the response of an authoritarian parent, right? I know best, I know your truth, I know the truth, and I'm going to impose that on you in the ways that are described. Then we have authoritative parenting style. Authoritative parents also have rules that children are expected to follow. However, there are some exceptions to the rules. There's a flexibility in authoritative parenting. They often tell children the reasons for the rules, and they're more willing to consider a child's feelings when setting limits. And again, we'll talk about permissive in a moment, but remember, going too far with this, right? Believing that you have to justify, explain, defend rules all the time. You can get into that pattern very easily, you can see here, right? When we get to permissive, the child needs to like it or believe it or self-initiate. But in this case, there's some dialogue and discussion. Authoritative parents tend to vary consequences and use positive consequences to reinforce desirable behaviors rather than punishment to respond to negative behaviors, and may be more willing than authoritarian parents to use praise. And that's really just a positive reinforcement. Children raised with authoritative discipline tend to be happy and successful. They are often good at making decisions and evaluating safety risks on their own. They often grow up to be responsible adults who feel comfortable expressing their opinions. From the literature, we know these things to be true. Right? That authoritative parenting is, of the parenting styles, the more ideal of the parenting styles. We all have some aspects, and even at times, one thing that they note is even at times of the day, times of stress, we'll demonstrate different kinds of parenting styles, various parenting styles. But authoritative is, the buck does stop here. I'm going to make the decision. You can be mad at me. You can disagree with me. And I want to hear what you think and feel. And I'm not going to try to talk you into it or make you like it. Right? There's balance in authoritative. But it's important that it is authoritative. That the literature suggests that having appropriate hierarchy in parenting, that is, the executive system is what they refer to it as. The executive system gets to make the decisions for the house rules. And in this type of parenting, there's all this other stuff that goes along with it, like the discussion, like the feelings, like the sharing, like the exceptions to the rule, and so forth. Permissive parenting. Permissive parents often don't offer much discipline. They don't offer much discipline often. They tend to be lenient and may only step in when there's a serious problem. There may be few consequences for misbehavior because parents have an attitude of kids will be kids. Permissive parents may take on more of a friend role than a parent role. They may encourage their children to talk to them about their problems, but may not discourage a lot of bad behaviors. I think when I see, and we have a fair bit of this in our program and in the parents that we work with, I think there is this friend, this I need to be liked, I need to be thought of as a good father, as a good mother. Right? If you think of me as unloving or unfair or unkind or go down the list, then that'll be too hard for me to tolerate. And that's not really a conscious thought that our parents have. But when you dissect it a bit, when you pull it apart a little bit, you can see that dynamic. And so it really does come from, oftentimes, a parent whose sense of self was not encouraged, right? Often coming from autocratic or authoritarian families. And so there's no sense of self. There's no sense of I'm okay. And I bring that okayness to my parenting. Kids who grow up with permissive parents tend to struggle academically. They may exhibit more behavioral problems as they will likely not appreciate authority and rules. They often have low self-esteem and may report a lot of sadness, which is strange, right? We don't think of depression and anxiety resulting from permissiveness, but it does. In the literature, it does. And I think that's fascinating. Signs that you might be a permissive parent. Children don't have a schedule. Talking about young children's day, the child's day lacks structure. Parents with permissive styles emphasize the importance of the child being a kid. Right? They excuse and justify. I think a lot of you can relate to this when you end up or come to the point where you write the impact letter for your child in our program, where you see how over time that things have gotten so far out of balance, so far away from anywhere close to the ideal, and that you found yourself justifying it along the way. They value the child's freedom over the responsibility, right? And again, I think parents who struggle from this, my opinion is, I think they're a bit handicapped or handcuffed psychologically because so little of them was recognized by their parents. And so these parents are trying to compensate for their own childhood. There are very few, if any, real rules, right? Often permissive parents will talk about rules or ideals or behaviors, but really there's nothing with any teeth into it. There's nothing that gets reinforced. You wait for your child to ask for help, right? Only when it gets to that point, or only when it gets to the point that the behavior is so far out of control and even dangerous, does a permissive parent step in. You seek your child's opinion on major decisions. At our program, I see this all the time. And I always say to parents, you want to ask your adolescent children. Young adults, it's a different game because they have some legal authority to make their own decision. But I think with all of them, you always ask. You want to know what your child feels and thinks and wants. And you digest that information through what I call the parent or the adult filter, right? It doesn't hurt to ask. And even that dialogue, which can make an impact on your decision, that dialogue changes the way the child experiences the dynamic, experiences themselves. They see themselves as valued. And they also learn that not everything that they say they want gets, that wish gets fulfilled. And that's okay. And they learn to adjust to that. So I think that's an important distinction to make here. But giving your child the vote, right? I have to give them X, Y, or Z because they're asking for it, or they're going to be sad or angry or give up, whatever that is. If it gets to that point, then you know you're in this permissive style in that area. They bribe their children. And bribery is simply, the difference between bribery and positive reinforcement is that bribery is giving the reward before the behavior. And we know over time that it's not very effective. It's not as effective as giving the reward afterward. You rarely give out consequences. You'd rather be your child's friend rather than an authority figure. And again, I think that comes from the compensation from your own childhood, and I think it also comes from just that lack of self that develops in authoritarian parenting. What does the literature say about the outcomes of permissive parenting? Children who don't receive enough guidance don't learn problem-solving skills. Right? There's some modeling and teaching that goes on in the authoritative parenting. Kids are less likely to strive to become better parents when parents don't encourage them to challenge themselves. We talk about this in the idea of reinforcement, and it talks about it in the book Nurture Shock, that we reinforce effort, we reinforce doing things difficult, we even allow them to struggle to figure it out. And when we don't provide any of that structure or any of that guidance, we see them not feeling good about themselves and not being willing to take a risk, a healthy risk. Children might be at an increased risk of obesity because parents don't set limits on food intake. They don't encourage or reinforce or require healthy doses of outdoor play and exercise, of movement. Permissive parents don't monitor screen time, which can lead to excessive television and computer use. We see that a lot. Preschoolers with permissive parents may be at a higher risk of mental health issues, including depression and anxiety. Again, that's a strange finding, but when we identify parenting systems or households where this is the case, we see more anxiety and depression. Children may behave more aggressively. When children aren't taught how to deal with their emotions effectively, they tend to show more aggressive behavior. Studies have linked permissive parenting with increased alcohol use, higher rates of school misconduct, and lower levels of academic achievement in adolescence. So again, we see this dynamic between parents and children, and oftentimes when, I call it a balloon payment. I think evoke often is kind of a balloon payment for the child and the parent on some of the things that have gone by the wayside because of some of these. Then there's another parenting style called chaotic or uninvolved. It's a little bit different than permissive. They often do not meet their child's basic needs and may expect children to raise themselves. Sometimes this is due to a parent's mental health issue or substance abuse problems. They may also lack knowledge about parenting and child development or may feel overwhelmed by life's other problems. I think that was more of my childhood, actually. My mother was a single mother, overwhelmed, financially overwhelmed with us boys. I just don't think she had a lot to give. Didn't have a lot of good positive. I think that's one that I identify more with. Uninvolved parents tend to have little knowledge of what their children are doing. There tends to be few, if any, rules or expectations. Children may not receive any nurturing or guidance, and they lack the much needed parental attention. When parents are uninvolved, children tend to lack self-esteem and perform poorly academically. They also exhibit frequent behavioral problems and rank low in happiness. So this is a distant, uninvolved, uninformed, overwhelmed parent, right? And I think this is maybe the reason that this one doesn't make it into the literature as often is because it's fairly uncommon and very clear when it happens. And it's uncommon, I think, for me to talk about because I don't think this fits with many of the parents that I've worked with over the years. This would be a small percentage of the category. So what's the take home? Because like I said, this can be heavy stuff. And a lot of parents can be inclined to just beat themselves up. And the only thing that matters in all of this parenting education and discussion that we do, the only thing that matters is if it has a positive effect on it. If it causes us to want to crawl into a hole, if it causes us to want to hide, to defend ourselves, to beat ourselves up in any way, then it's just coming from shame. And that's not what any of this is about. Right? This is about awareness. This is about healing the wounds that we bring to the table and how they affect our children. It's important to remember that you might oscillate between various styles and various times. You're going to experience everybody has a little bit of some of these things in them. Some of us more clearly tend to one style. But part of it is to figure out how to learn balance, to figure out how to take the positive, the assets that we have, the strengths that we have, to acknowledge them, and then the weakness and the vulnerabilities that we have, and pay attention to them and give them a little bit of extra effort. I talk about this in the book from a quote from David Wolf, who talks about these two fish swimming along and an older fish coming the other way, and the older fish says to the two younger fish, "How's the water today, boys?" and swims by, and after a moment, one of the young fish says to the other young fish, "What the hell is water?" And the lesson is about learning about your context. If everything is blue, there's no color. If everything is water, there's no not water. And so part of what we learn in therapy, ideally, it's not the education, it's not the exchange of information. That's a part of it. But it's experiencing a different context. And when we experience a different context, and you can experience that in a lot of ways, by traveling abroad, by traveling around this country into different cultures. My son is for our classes in Washington, D.C. this week, learning about Israel and United States relations for a class that he has in a group that he's taken. He's been texting me today saying, it's so incredible, the different worldviews. And he lived in New York City for 2 years in the Spanish sections of the boroughs. He said, but it's just so interesting to see the differences. And so he can then look back on the context that we raised him and said, oh, that's just one context. That's not everything. So you have to experience, experientially, the not water. And that's a little bit about what Evoke does for your children. What good therapy does for any of us is we experience something different. And then we can look back and actually see our context. So exploring your own childhood and the parenting you received is the first step. It's always the first step in this work. And then you can be intentional. And there's still going to be some hard wiring that you're going to have to battle. Because again, it's not about information. This stuff has been wired into us. And I refer to parenting education and therapies as software upload, but that takes a long time to overcome to affect your hardwiring. So exploring your own childhood and the parenting you receive is the first and foremost thing. Try not to compensate for your parents or your partner too much, right? That's a pattern that a lot of us get. We see a co-parent whose focus is discipline, and we become extra nurturing with fewer and fewer rules and become an exaggeration of ourselves. Or vice versa, we see the other parent never holds any boundaries, and so we crack the whip more often, and we become an exaggeration of ourselves. So being aware in our current relationships about how we compensate is important. Again, notice as I describe that dynamic, what I call polarized parenting, as I describe polarized parenting, there's no discussion of the child. The child's not in that equation, not really. It's about the partner relationship or ex-partner relationship. Learning to see your child. First, you need to see yourself and your context, that is, what the world was like for you and what it taught you. All the things that you take for granted, all the things that you imagine to yourself are normal, ordinary, and they're not. Nobody grows up in an ordinary house with ordinary parents. Everyone is different and unique in some important ways, and learning about that. Learning about what is taken for granted, what was not discussed in your context, which was not overt, right? Those are the important things that we look at in therapy. And then education is a part of it, and then experiencing the non-water, going back to that metaphor, experiencing what wasn't you. You know, a non-anxious, curious, patient, compassionate, loving context where you're okay, for example, you're always okay. That's a different context than most of us had growing up. So we learn that, we feel that, and then we can go back after having seen ourselves clearly and then begin to see our children more clearly. All right, I'm happy to take any questions. Once you have made the mistake of being permissive, and your child is already 18 with just a few months left of high school, what is the best boot camp approach to correcting as much as possible without becoming too over-authoritarian? That's a good question, and it takes a lot of work. Because, again, there's going to be a fear to become authoritarian because most likely, typically, the wound that is in you from having had a parent who couldn't see you, didn't see you. And so it's a case-by-case thing. The best thing is therapy. The best thing is exploring your childhood. But it's not always about tell me about your childhood. Sometimes it's about talking through what you're thinking about with your child. And understanding the thinking that is going into it. And learning to listen to your thinking and saying, oh, I'm doing this for this other reason. I'm doing this to be good or to not be hated or rejected. Or I'm doing this because I believe it's my responsibility to make him successful or her successful. And so when you do that kind of work and that kind of work on your thinking and you understand where it comes from, you can heal it. But remember, important, I can't say this too much tonight. I was talking to a client about this today. It's so important to develop a compassionate practice at looking at yourself. The only way to heal these patterns, the only way to heal them is to have compassion toward yourself first. Because then you're going to be able to look at it without being overwhelmed by it, without being bad, if you will. And then you can unravel it slowly and get at it. And then, I think for the parents that I've worked with over the years, my last thought to this question would be that you have to, the questions that we have in our lives and relationships can't be outcome based. If I do this, what will happen? Right? Because we can't predict that, and they're not an object. They're a subject with agency. And so the question is about finding my truth, my authenticity. Finding out what's clear about me and how I want to show up in a relationship. And then letting go and turning it over to our child. Because maybe the thing that is common between the permissive and the authoritarian parenting styles is that there's this idea of control. I can control you. In permissive parenting, it's I can get you to like me. Think I'm a good dad, think I'm a good mom, be happy. And in authoritarian, it's I can control you to make you successful. And authoritative is going to be more, here's my truth, here's what I want to know you, I want to see you, and then I'm going to make a decision, and then you're going to get to feel and think about it what you want to. And I don't need that outcome to be any different. And I can't control what you do. So that's the work in therapy, and for me, it's kind of it's situation by situation, question by question, and then learning to listen to your thinking and saying, this is what I'm doing. I'm doing this thing in parenting, and I know where I'm getting stuck. Is it common for kids to come home after being at a voc to find that their parents have taken on another parenting style? Are the kids prepared to see a change like this, and if so, how do they typically respond? Great question. It's hard to adopt a completely new style, but I think children often see the changes. I think they often see the changes in the letters, during the visits and during the phone calls and during the graduation, the transition process. I think they see it gradually when the parents are doing it, and they acknowledge that, and they can tell the difference. They're going to try to fit into the old system, right? There's going to be a face-to-face test, a live test, if you will, where the child will say, and this is all unconscious, can I go back to the old way? Because their brain is wired by you, right? Their brain is wired to think and behave and respond and reinforce in certain ways. So those things are going to be unconscious. I prepare them to not expect any change. That's what I say, is don't expect any change. If you're waiting for them to change, you might not get it. So you just come focusing on you. I say the same thing to you that I say to them, which is assume nobody else is going to change and assume you're going to have to make the change. But I want to talk about one other thing that you might be asking about too, which is I think when parents take for example, a more authoritative approach compared to a permissive approach, which is probably the most common change that we see in this process for parents, I think children struggle with it. I think they're going to try to test the old way, to try to pull the old strings, push the old buttons. And if the parents are doing their work and are willing to resist responding the old ways, I think the child will come around. But yeah, you setting a boundary, you being clear, you showing up authentically, assertively, honestly, courageously, heroically, all that stuff, that's oftentimes going to be hard for them at first. We do talk about that, and they do get a good dose of it from us while they're here, but they'll struggle with it. I talk about this healthy betrayal. A lot of students and clients talk about feeling betrayed, and sometimes they're talking about something that in family systems theory is a very healthy thing. If I have a boundary with you, if I betray our old implicit contract that we're peers, right, or friends, or I need to be liked, and now I'm going to show up differently in any relationship, that is a betrayal. And it's a healthy betrayal, right? There are things that would be healthy for me to betray if I made a promise to you that I shouldn't have made, that was made out of fear or anxiety or guilt. And I go back on that. That's a healthy betrayal. And I let you be angry about it. I don't blame you for it. I expect it. I prepare myself from it. And I'm unattached to your reaction. So that's what you might be talking about. And we try to prepare them, but I would say the same thing to you that I say to them, which is don't expect anything wonderful to change and just focus on yourself and you'll be well set up. All right. I'm going to go through some of the announcements. Upcoming workshops. I've put that on there. I think we just scheduled one just the other day and I was on vacation. Finding You, we still have one spot at Finding You in Park City on the January 15th to the 18th. If any of you want to do your deeper work about your family, about your own history, about your context, it's a great place to do it. I'll be running that January 15th at 2 p.m. to the 18th at 2 p.m. And then we have Finding You in February and Finding Family in March. To learn more, go to our website or talk to Stephanie or email intensives@evoketherapy.com. We want everybody to go to 6 12-step support groups while their child is with us. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, Nar-Anon, or Al-Anon Alateen. You can go to the websites to find out where there are meetings in your area. You can also go to nonme.org, and that can give you free resources and also classes that are affordable or free in your community. We scheduled some parent support groups coming up. New York City is January 4th And then January 29th will be in Los Angeles. We'll have that Sunday afternoon potluck. Forget that daylight savings. That's a typo. That was from the last time that we had it. The 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock parent meeting preceded by a 4 o'clock potluck on a Sunday, so you don't have to worry about LA traffic. And then we'll give you the exact location, but we're going to do a different location in the Bay Area this time. We're going to do it in San Mateo. We've been asked to do it more toward the South Bay, so we're heading down sort of closer to there. Remember, you can listen to our podcasts, these podcasts, and old webinars podcasts by going to Evoke Therapy Program, by searching Evoke Therapy Programs, or on the Android device, you can go to the SoundCloud app and also search Evoke Therapy Programs. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram, Facebook. Find the Alumni Foundation on Facebook and our blog, of course. Pursuits are our high adventure trips for families and young adults. The book is available on paperback on Amazon. You can go to the Parent Alumni Foundation book page, look at my book and other books that have been recommended by parents, and a percentage of the profits go to, a percentage of the purchase goes to help families who can't afford therapy. All right, Steve, I'm happy to take another question if there is one. I will come out to Chicago too. I know there's a request for a Chicago one. We'll probably do a Chicago one in March. When you recognize or acknowledge something in your shadow self, is it appropriate to share that with your teenage child? Well, that's a tough one. Not always. Not always. Sometimes. It depends on why you're doing it. For me, the more work that I do in my own therapy, the more clear I am about what I share with clients and others. That I'm trying to, and it's not raw. It doesn't have me. I'm well out of it. I've done a lot of talking to my therapist and healing around it. So, how conscious, how intentional, what's your reason? And a lot of that gets sorted out in therapy around that topic. So I would say that there's no blanket yes or no to this question. There are definitely, I do a lot, as you know, I do a lot of disclosure on these webinars and in my client sessions and even with my children. But I've also been in therapy for 25 years and I have been in therapy with the same therapist for 17 years straight now. So that gives me some grounding, some awareness around what's going on and why I'm sharing it. If it's just unconscious, if it's a boundary violation or an intrusion, if it's for a reason that I know not of, then those are all murky waters to step into with your child. So that's what I would say about that. Thank you for that. All right, Thursday this week I'll be talking about goals, resolutions, and change, both in our children and in us. That's this Thursday, the 29th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. Hope you all have a great 48 hours, and I'll talk to you then. Thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you, Steve, for moderating. Take care.